This is based in part on a book I just published called China Shifts Gears. The book is really about technology transfer and how to acquire advanced technologies. And I look at the 3 US-China joint ventures in automobiles, Beijing Jeep, Shanghai GM, and Chang'an Ford, and look at the extent to which the US companies transferred cleaner and more energy efficient technologies. And I'll come back to some of the conclusions at the end. So, similar, actually. China and the United States have many similar energy characteristics. China's main energy-related challenges are that they need energy for economic growth. They have increasing foreign dependency for oil and gas. Provision of energy to China is poor. Energy services to China is poor. Severe urban air pollution. How many people have been to China in this crowd? So you know that many of China's biggest cities are suffering from extraordinary urban air pollution. Massive acid deposition in as much of a third of China's land. China's contribution to global climate change. And last and relevant to all of the above, China's access to advanced energy technologies to address all of these challenges. In China, I think energy security, more than anything, is ensuring that there are adequate supplies of energy to meet economic demand. But China's long-term energy security, and also that of the United States, is equally dependent, in my own opinion, on its ability to meet future demand for energy without causing intolerable environmental damage. And I think the central challenge, in fact, is how to meet future energy needs in the context of global climate change. I want to quickly examine, sort of put China in perspective, since we're in a US audience, and just give you some comparative figures here. In terms of total energy consumption, and by that I mean commercial energy consumption, China consumes 2/3 as much total energy as the United States. In terms of CO2 emissions, China consumes 61%, or emits 61% as much CO2 as the United States. In terms of total oil consumption, China consumes 1/3 as much oil as the United States presently. China imports 1/3 as much oil as the United States. So there's been a lot of, I think I would characterize it as hysteria about the growth of China and China's energy demand, and particularly China's oil demand. But in total, I really want to emphasize that in total, China's oil and energy demand is much, much less than ours. Another definition of energy security to China is coal. I think in the United States we tend to think a lot about oil, although we use a huge amount of coal as well. But in China, coal is king, and last year, China consumed 37% of the world's total coal consumption. And coal accounts for 3/4 of commercial energy supply in China. One impressive measure that the Chinese government has taken is to set a goal of quadrupling economic output in the next 20 years, but only doubling energy use. And that would be a very impressive achievement in terms of energy efficiency. Most of China's power consumption is coal. And almost all of that is subcritical pulverized coal power plants. This presents a real challenge in terms of global climate change because it's very difficult to reduce CO2 emissions from pulverized coal power plants. Nuclear is only 2% of electricity production in China, and it would be difficult to expand that fraction very much in the foreseeable future. Cars. China's car culture is alive and well. Here are 3 pictures I've taken in recent years. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a picture from the Beijing Auto Show a couple of years ago. You'll see a little SUV toy that was being used in a city square, and a salesman for Ford China. A Nielsen survey last month said that 13% of consumers in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou intend to buy a car in the next 12 months. There are a lot of people that live in those 3 cities, so I think it's very likely that sales of passenger cars are going to continue to increase fairly dramatically. Here's a picture of Beijing that I took last year, and you can see that already there's a huge number of cars in China and a fair amount of urban air pollution as well. Motor vehicles have become the leading source of urban air pollution in most of China's big cities. And this is a function of China having weaker pollution control standards, relatively poor fuel quality, and the somewhat dated vehicle technology that's in the vehicles. Passenger car production in China has been dramatically growing. As you can see, as recently as the early 90s, China was producing fewer than 100,000 cars per year. And really at the beginning of this century, passenger cars, the sale of passenger cars really took off. And China's on the verge of becoming the number 2 car producer in the world. As of 2005, there were approximately 20 million passenger cars on the road, probably more like 25 million today. That's compared with, does anyone know how many we have in the United States? About, almost 220 million. Okay, let me say a few things about oil, since that is the topic of the conference. China became the 2nd largest consumer of oil in the world in the year 2004, and it now imports about 3.5 million barrels per day. It's the 3rd largest oil importer after the United States and Japan. More than half of China's imports come from the Middle East, so they're much more strongly dependent in terms of the fraction of their oil imports than we are in the United States. Interestingly, China's top supplier this year has switched from Saudi Arabia to Angola, which is a rather interesting development. Much has been made in the news of China's effort to go out and purchase supplies of oil, and McKinsey reports that $15 billion has been spent in the last 5 years to acquire 100 foreign oil fields and companies. China has just finished its first strategic petroleum reserve, the Zhenghai Reserve, with a capacity of 32 million barrels of oil. So what can we say about the future? It all depends, of course. On the left here, I've just given you the United States government's projections. This is what they call the reference case. And as you can see, the United States continues to remain the dominant consumer of oil by a large margin out to 2030. And China's oil consumption continues to increase pretty much at the same rate. Overall, in terms of energy consumption, you can see in the top right-hand corner, China's projected to surpass the United States in about 2030, and its carbon dioxide emissions much sooner than that, somewhere around 2015. No one wants to deny, I don't think, the Chinese, or the Americans for that matter, the energy services that they need to sustain their economy. And I do believe that one way we can make a big difference is through advanced technology. And one of the efforts in our project has been to try and figure out how to develop and deploy cleaner and more energy efficient technologies in both the United States, China, and India. And so that was really the inquiry that I set out to try and look at with my book, which was really to see how is China acquiring the technology that they would need to be able to kind of change the pathway that the United States had been on for so many years. I had 7 main findings from my book. The first was that the United States did not, the US companies in China did not substantially contribute to improving Chinese vehicle technological capabilities because very little knowledge about the technology was transferred along with the product. And this has big implications for how China will develop the technological know-how for sort of transitioning to a different future. The Chinese government failed to design an aggressive and consistent strategy for acquiring advanced automotive technologies from foreigners in the industry. And so this raises questions about the Chinese government's likelihood to do that in the future. You know, both United States and Chinese companies were very profit motivated in the way they formed their joint ventures, not surprisingly. And this tended to sort of push out any kind of focus on energy efficiency and pollution control. One disappointing finding was that the US firms did not transfer any pollution control technology to the Chinese until they were required to do so by the Chinese government through the establishment of pollution control standards. So there was sort of no altruism in the sense of even transferring somewhat dated pollution control technology. And then the technologies that were transferred were very rarely, if ever, updated once they were put into production in the Chinese market. So what does all of this say? I think that I wrote an article quite soon after finishing this book called Limits to Leapfrogging. And that until significantly different incentives were put into place, it was unlikely that China was going to leapfrog to advanced technologies, different technologies, and that you needed to have incentives in place to achieve that goal. And I think that's where the role of government and the need for policy on these questions becomes paramount. And with the imposition of fuel efficiency standards, pollution control standards, I think you could make a big dent or change in the growth curve there that you can see on the screen. So thank you very much.